Chapter 15 of Julia Ried. This recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 15, in which is discussed the difference between white and black. The next rehearsal was one continued scene of confusion. Nothing seemed to go quite right. Everyone present seemed fully bent on having his or her own way, and no two persons agreed about the fold of a curtain or the position of a table. I ought to except little Ruth Walker. She was meek and mouse-like as usual. Her fair, pleasant face had flushed with surprise when Lycia Simons, in the richest of black silks and resplendent in sable furs, pressed and pushed her way into our shop one afternoon, tipping over several piles of boxes in her transit, and finally reaching Ruth's stand, preferred her requests for Ruth's assistance in the tableaux. Flushed with surprise and pleasure, evidently little Ruth liked fun, she gave ready assent, and on this evening of which I write, hovered softly among us like the meekest little Quaker one could imagine, and the busiest. Her deft fingers made the needle fairly fly, and many were the patient stitches which she took that night in the endless garments which needed a little "fixing." In her way she was the most popular one among us. Before 9 o'clock every girl present had learned who would sew on a string, or pin a bow, or hold things while they fixed them, or run to the dressing room for a shawl or a sack, or run into the store below for a paper of pins, or do any of the thousand little things that were constantly pressing forward to be done, doing them, too, with such a pleased and gentle face that Mr. Sayles said to me in undertone, "I think that Ruth, as you call her, must be a real flesh and blood Quakeress, or a niece of Job's." But there was a great deal of friction. Lycia Simons, for one, seemed bent on making all the trouble that she could in a gay, good-humored sort of way, bent, first of all, upon coming in contact with Mrs. Tyndall and her schemes. The first general discussion came up toward the close of the evening. We had been rehearsing the most difficult tableau in the list, and had sat down to rest and finish articles for the "grab bag." Then Florence Hervey commenced it. "Mrs. Tyndall, do you know that Lycia isn't making a thing for this bag?" "Why, isn't that little pink and white dolly for the bag? I'm sure I supposed it was." "She thinks grab bags are coarse and common." "Ours is an exception," answered Mrs. Tyndall, with unfailing good humor. "It is to be made of silk patchwork that is over 100 years old, and the bag is to be grabbed for afterward, at so much a ticket. Lycia, you'll grab for that, won't you?" "Not I," said Lycia emphatically. "I'm not in sympathy with grab bags. I'm sorry we are obliged to descend to anything of the sort. And by the way, Mrs. Tyndall, do you know that Dr. Mulford entirely disapproves of ring cakes?" Mrs. Tyndall sewed on in good-humored indifference as she answered, "I wasn't aware of that formidable fact, my dear. At least, I do not remember to have heard it. Fanny, a blue sash for that dolly would match her eyes better than the one you have chosen." Meantime Lycia gave a wicked nod and sparkle of her eyes to her next neighbor, and murmured, "I'm going to transform myself into an angel of light now." Then aloud, "Do you think it is quite proper for us to indulge in speculations of which he disapproves?" Mrs. Tyndall laughed lightly. "Why, my dear child, perhaps he disapproves of eating oysters in the evening. Many people do. Shall we, therefore, banish them from our bill of fare?" It was timid little Ruth, with blushing cheeks, who took up the question. "But, Mrs. Tyndall, there is no moral question involved in eating oysters." "I don't know about that," laughed Mr. Sayles. "I ate the articles in question last evening, and my digestive organs have been in a very immoral state ever since." "And for the matter of that," chimed in Mrs. Tyndall, "I don't see the immorality of a pound cake. I think there is as much of that quality involved in the one article as the other." "Ruthie," said Lycia in undertone, "when Mrs. Tyndall tries to make you think black is white, don't you believe it." Then she returned to the charge. "Mrs. Tyndall, if I were a lawyer I should charge you with begging the question. Isn't there, after all, a marked difference between ring cakes and oysters? If Dr. Mulford chooses to think that selling slices of cake at so much a slice, so that some 10-cent purchaser will chance to secure a gold ring for a 40th part of its value, a species of gambling, hasn't he a right to do it?" "Undoubtedly he has, my dear, but don't put green ribbon on that cushion, white is better. Suppose you choose to think it a perfectly innocent and rather amusing way of making a little money for a good cause, haven't you the same right?" "The right to think, perhaps, but not to act; for supposing him to be right and myself wrong, which is certainly possible, a bad example would be set and much mischief might be done, while, on the other hand, no possible harm could ensue from giving up the project." "That's remarkably well put, Lycia," Mr. Sayles said, with a touch of evident admiration in his voice. "I'm not sure but you ought to be a lawyer." Mrs. Tyndall laughingly agreed, and gave her undivided attention to the staring wax doll at her left, while Lycia continued her "aside" comments. "Do you suppose she will give me a direct answer if I talk from now until day after to morrow? I mean to try it." "Seriously, Mrs. Tyndall, is it courteous to persist in a matter that the pastor of our church cannot approve, when we call our entertainment a church festival, and the proceeds are for the benefit of the church? Hasn't the pastor a right to dictate in such a matter?" Mrs. Tyndall hesitated. It was a member of her Bible class who asked the question. It was asked about her pastor, and it became her to hesitate. When she spoke her voice was sweetness itself. "My dear Lycia, it is a great pleasure to see you so desirous of doing just right, and so solicitous of our pastor's honor. It is really very becoming. Now let me explain matters to you a little. We have to study to please other people, as well as ourselves in this world; and Mrs. Chandler, a woman of no religious principle whatever, chooses to interest herself in a ring cake, and is thereby drawn into work very industriously with us. Now Dr. Mulford may not quite approve her manner of work; may say so in a very quiet, confidential way, to your mother, for instance. But he is certainly a man of too correct views of propriety, too much good sense, to interfere openly, and thereby cause an unnecessary commotion." "But suppose, Mrs. Tyndall, that his sense of propriety isn't equal to the occasion, and that he does interfere quite openly. What is going to be done about it?" "In the first place, my dear, we will not insult his good sense by supposing such a foolish thing. Don't you think you are getting that hem a trifle wider than is necessary? There will not be room for the fold." Lycia laughed with the utmost good humor, rather as though she had triumphed instead of being worsted; and, on the whole, I think she did, for I heard her say to Florence Hervey soon after with the utmost glee: "I told you it would be simply impossible to smuggle her into a corner that she couldn't slip out of." It was not the only question that came up for discussion during the evening. The next excitement was little Ruthie. "Put that small Quaker into our Turkish scene," I heard Mr. Sayles say to our commander-in-chief. "What! Ruth Walker? Do you really mean it? I'm not sure but it would be an excellent idea. Her face would be a capital foil to some of the others." Ruth, however, on being appealed to, with very downcast eyes and a very flushed face, but with the most decided voice, declined being one of the ladies of the harem. Mrs. Tyndall persisted and argued, even descended to coaxing, while Mr. Sayles grew more eager over it every moment. Ruth did not like the tableau, did not think it was pretty nor "nice," and would not take part in it. "Sensible girl," Fred Thompson said to Mr. Sayles. "If all the other ladies in the crowd would follow her example, it would become them better. I don't like that picture." But Mr. Sayles shrugged his shoulders, and said: "It is only because you are not the Sultan." Now all this, in consideration of the fact that I was chief lady of the harem, was not pleasant to me. I wondered in a bewildered sort of way what they could all mean. When I look back on those days, and remember, despite all the careful culture and painstaking education that had been given me, what a poor, silly simpleton I was, I am amazed that I did not get further astray even than I did. Oh, mother, mother, how I did dishonor the blessed memory of one who tried so hard to guide me in the right way. The excitement over the Turkish scene had scarcely subsided when another ensued. We were preparing for our homeward walk when Mrs. Tyndall reiterated her parting injunction: "Now, girls, do try to be early tomorrow evening. We have very little time and a great deal to do. It will be especially important for you to be prompt, Miss Walker, as you have joined us so recently, and have a great deal to learn." Then Ruth's fair, childlike face flushed again, as she answered gently: "I cannot come here tomorrow evening, Mrs. Tyndall." "You cannot? Why, that is very unfortunate. I wish you had mentioned it before. We supposed, of course, that you would be able to attend the rehearsals when we invited you to join us. I really think you will have to waive your other engagement, whatever it is, and be present tomorrow evening." "I did not suppose you would have rehearsal tomorrow evening, because of the prayer meeting. That is the reason why I cannot come." At this earnestly spoken answer I winced a little, for was not tomorrow evening's prayer meeting the one I was supposed to attend, and yet I had not thought of it, and was making eager plans for the evening? Lycia Simons telegraphed a glance, full of triumphant amusement, to Mr. Sayles, and awaited Mrs. Tyndall's reply with evident interest. It was very gentle and courteous. "Your interest in the prayer meeting is certainly commendable. A habit of regular attendance is very desirable, and as you are so young you may readily be pardoned for carrying it to an extreme. But, my dear girl, duty sometimes interferes with our pleasures. Quite a number of us will be obliged to waive our regular custom tomorrow evening, and sacrifice ourselves to the work that must be done here. We would willingly postpone it if we could, but the time is very short. So I don't see but you will have to be one of the victims." There was a peculiar curve to Lycia's lip, and an eager interest in her eye as she bent forward for Ruth's answer. The shy little girl blushed painfully at finding herself the center of observation, but her voice had not lost a shade of its decisive ring, as she answered: "I can not come, Mrs. Tyndall. I have been taught to consider an attendance at the prayer meeting among my first duties, to which all matters of minor importance must yield, and I feel quite sure that mother would not approve." Just then I envied that quiet, meek-faced little shop girl, whose mother did fine ironing for a living; envied her simple, straightforward firmness. I felt that I would give much if I stood just where she did, if I could have consistently stood by her in her decision. But there seemed to be a great mountain of inconsistent acts for me to climb over before I could reach that place, and I had not the moral courage to make a beginning. Ah me! I, too, knew a mother who I was quite sure would not approve of this, nor of a great many other acts of mine. I have always thought that amid all her faults Mrs. Tyndall had one good quality. She was unfailingly and persistently good-humored. When she absolutely could not make things work to suit herself, she gracefully and good-naturedly yielded. She turned from Ruth with a slight laugh as she said: "Oh, well, please yourself. At your age one cannot be expected to be very wise or thoughtful." And to Lycia she added before Ruth was fairly out of hearing: "This comes from your talent of mixing incongruous elements." "I must say I admired the little thing," Mr. Sayles said as we walked homeward. "She stood up staunchly for what she conceived to be her duty, and it required considerable moral courage." Then, in a kind of uttered undertone: "I wish I had an equal amount." Mrs. Tyndall laughed. "Julia," she said, "I am glad that you are a strong-minded and sensible young lady, and will not be likely to rush off to prayer meeting tomorrow evening, leaving us to do the work, merely for the sake of winning this romantic gentleman's approval." I had no answer ready, and went to my room grave and somewhat heavy-hearted. Little Ruth had dealt a stab at my inconsistencies that I could not immediately rally from. We had not heard the last of the ring cake. Dr. Mulford called on the afternoon before the festival. We were very busy rearranging my costume for one of the tableaux. When the doctor asked for a few moments' conversation, I arose to leave them, but Mrs. Tyndall detained me with an appealing hand. "Pray, Julia, do not desert me. We have not a moment to lose. Doctor, is it something very special and private, so that I mustn't keep Julia? You see we are so exceedingly busy." It was in regard to the festival that he wished to speak, Dr. Mulford explained. "Oh, then, Julia ought to stay. I assure you she has been quite as wicked as I have during the whole of it." I sat down again, feeling very much as if I ought to be away. Then the entire question of church gambling came up, and was discussed somewhat at length. Mrs. Tyndall tried several different tactics. At first she was gay and playful. The ring, she assured him, would be pure gold of the finest quality, no shamming about it; and the cake should be as white and light as pound cake could be made. The doctor was not to be silenced in that way. He was grave and in earnest. Then she questioned him. What possible harm could there be in allowing young people to extract a little amusement from a ring and a cake? He answered her with another question. What harm would there be in permitting two gentlemen to play at cards during the evening, for the amusement of the guests at the festival, and at its close present the money thus won to the church? "Oh, that is a very different thing," she told him. "It was money made by chance," he answered, "and by playing upon the passion for trying one's luck; a passion which was found to a greater or less extent in the mind of every young person; the very passion which, if encouraged and cultivated, forms a confirmed gambler. Certainly we did not want to teach any such lesson in a church festival." Mrs. Tyndall looked laughingly incredulous. "Now, doctor," she said, with an attempt at gravity, "do you really for one moment suppose that there will be a single person at our church festival who will be so devoid of brains as to be injured by so trifling a thing?" Dr. Mulford answered with grave emphasis: "I don't know anything about that, madam; only God does. There might very possibly be a good company gathered together who would none of them become professional pickpockets, even though they were to indulge in that amusement for one evening. Yet I do not think it would be well to set our young people at such a work tomorrow evening, even though the proceeds were presented to the church. The simple truth is, Mrs. Tyndall, that we must abstain from all appearance of evil. We must not cover with the guise of charity and religion what the whole world condemns. We must not teach our young people that it is right to gamble for rings and wrong to gamble for farms. If it is right to make $10 by chance, it is right to make $10,000 in the same way." Mrs. Tyndall grew grave and courteous. "I am sorry," she said gently, "that we did not understand your peculiar views before. It would have been easy enough in the first place to have avoided all this; but now you know Mrs. Chandler, doctor? She has the matter in hand. You know she is not apt to be interested in religious festivals of any sort, rarely does anything; but she has chosen to do this, seems deeply interested in it. I really think it may be the means of enlisting her assistance in other church matters. You know we must be all things to all men, doctor. Oh, there will good arise even from this; but I am sorry it has occurred. I would not have you annoyed for the world. It shall not occur again, I assure you." But she had a man of adamant opinions to deal with, and he frankly and kindly, but very plainly, explained to her that it would be impossible to countenance with his presence any such proceeding; that if it were carried out he must absent himself. Mrs. Tyndall had no desire for any such publicity, had not the slightest desire to quarrel with her pastor, and promptly assured him that of course, since he felt so deeply on the subject, the whole affair should be suppressed. I think it was at that time, however, that she mentally decided that the First Church of Newton really needed a younger man for their pastor. I have always considered it the very refinement of courteous revenge that Mrs. Tyndall bought the enormous and elaborate pound cake at an exorbitant price, and sent it, ring and all, daintily boxed and gracefully addressed, "For Mrs. Mulford, with Mrs. H. F. Tyndall's love." End of Chapter 15. Recording by Trisha G.